Hello, everyone joining us today. We are so happy that you are here. My name is Melissa Rogers, and I'm the Vice President of Business Development at Heritage Property Management Services. At Heritage, we pride ourselves with being able to provide you access to educational resources and reputable vendors. For those of you joining us today for the first time, we usually have these classes in person and in a little bit more of a cozy environment. However, recent circumstances are forcing us into the virtual market, and we're really encouraged by the engagement that you have with us. So if you haven't had the opportunity, I encourage anybody listening today to visit our website for more content and more full educational schedule that we do offer. Please visit heritageproperty.com and select the Homeowner Resources tab in the upper left center. Today, we are joined by Jay Lazega, Jamie Lyons, and Kathryn Roberts of Lazega and Johanson, one of our partners in law, to discuss how you can effectively run virtual meetings for your community association. All right, so lastly, before we get started, I'm just going to kick off some housekeeping rules for everybody. This event is being recorded and will be available to all of you that are joining us live today once we're finished. For those of you that are also joining us today, you will receive any handouts that are adjacent to this recording once it's distributed. All of you are in listen-only mode for today, so please feel free to engage with any questions in the Q&A section. That question box is in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. And lastly, thank you again for joining us today. I now turn this over to Jay with Lazega and Johanson. Here you go, Jay.
Awesome. Thanks, Melissa. Hello, everyone. I'm Jay Lazega, Jamie Lyons, Kathryn Roberts, my good friends. We are really excited to do this program for you guys. Thank you, Melissa and the Heritage team, for letting us do this. We are going to talk about virtual meetings and primarily focus on your annual meetings and elections. Just so everyone knows, we are conducting this safely. When Jamie gets animated later, we have our protective masks in place, so we'll be ready to go. We want this, and we're going to try to make this practical and hands-on. And the reality is, in this crazy, unprecedented time, we are doing things differently, and as community associations. And there has been a lot of discussion about Governor Kemp's executive orders, Georgia Secretary of State's conversations and communications, both of those recognizing, even encouraging corporate entities to conduct their shareholder membership meetings virtually or electronically instead of in person. And we frankly just think that that's what we've been able to do and what we should have been doing for the last decade anyway. We believe it's all authorized under the corporate code and other laws, and frankly, a much, much more efficient and effective way to conduct your meetings, particularly your elections. So we're going to talk about that today. We will take questions. They'll come in. Melissa and the team are going to filter them and pass on questions, and we'll handle those as we go if we can, but there will be a good amount of time at the end for question and answers. If we don't get to them all, feel free to reach out to us. We're all at ljlaw.com. JLJYL, Jamie L, Kathryn R. And if you've not visited our website, under our resources section of our website at ljlaw.com, we have a huge amount of great, useful stuff for communities, really primarily related to operating in the time of COVID. So whether it's sample waivers, if you open your amenities, sign samples, rules and regulations, communications to owners. My favorite on there is the communication sample to the owners who scream that they shouldn't have to pay dues because you are 3 weeks late opening the pool. We like to give you that stuff. Feel free to use it. It's on our website under the resources section. So this is a year where we're going to talk about very briefly normal procedures and rules for running your elections and annual meetings. The reality is that even though we are in the time of of a pandemic, we are still required to hold annual meetings, to conduct annual meetings. We're still required to conduct elections. We can't not do it because of the pandemic. We got a lot of flexibility about when to do it under the corporate code and about how to do it. But one really important message we want to give everybody is that this is a year where you shouldn't and you will not do that in person. The liability risk on us to do an annual meeting in person is nonsensical compared to the risk of possible claims that come from that, particularly when there are such easy and effective alternatives to doing it. So we're going to focus primarily on how to do this year without a physical in-person live meeting with our entire community gathering in a room. We are going to talk about different options for how to conduct the election, either at or during a virtual meeting, or our strong suggestion, doing that completely separate from your annual meeting. Whether you do it by an electronic voting site or whether you do it by mail-in ballot, we're going to talk about that. There are methods and possibilities to conduct a virtual annual meeting and do your election at the same time at that meeting, but it's extremely complicated. So while it's possible, we're going to focus on you not doing that, and instead you separating your election from your annual meeting. So thanks for letting us do this. We hope everyone is well and safe. We hope you enjoy this. We are going to start with Jamie recapping normal procedures quickly.
So I want to start by talking about the general types of meetings that associations usually have in regular times. So not 2020. And some of the procedures, well, not some, all of the procedures that associations have to follow to have a standard meeting of the association still apply even when you're dealing with a virtual meeting. So it's important that you recognize what the regular requirements are, because they translate into what you're going to still be obligated to do if you're having a virtual meeting. And again, as Jay said, we are strongly suggesting, we are strongly encouraging that you have virtual meetings for your annual meetings this year. And we will address issues about people.
And maybe future years as well.
Right, that's true, maybe future years. We will address issues about people who don't have computers and how you should address that kind of issue. But the vast majority of people will have access to and the ability to log on in some way. So when you're doing virtual meetings, these same rules apply as regular meetings. And so let me kind of very briefly go through some of these issues. There are three types of meetings that associations have. I'm going to focus on one of them primarily, but just give you a little flavor of the other two. And then we're going to talk about some definitions. The word quorum, the word notice, the word proxy, what those things mean, and how they are relevant in regular meetings and then translate into the virtual world. So the first thing I want to talk about is the types of meetings an association can have. And generally there are three. And you'll usually see the annual meeting. The annual meeting happens one time a year annually. So that would be once a year, just annually. And any other meeting the association has that where action is going to be taken, where business needs to be transacted, is a special meeting. And then there are the meetings that are either annual or special, where you don't have enough people there to do business. So they sort of convert or default into what I call a town hall gathering, or some people call them town hall meetings, but because they're not official meetings, I really like to call them gatherings. The other thing I want to mention about town hall gatherings is you can choose on purpose to have a town hall gathering, to gather people in the community, to give them information, to talk about certain things, to do a Q&A, where you know in advance you are not going to actually conduct any business. You're not going to take any votes. You're not having an election. So you can set up a meeting to start as a town hall gathering, never intending to actually have an official meeting. So on that note, if you know you're having a town hall meeting, notice is almost irrelevant. You can give it any way you want. You don't have to worry about a quorum, how many people have to be there to call the meeting to order and to conduct business. And you don't actually have to take minutes or notes or keep a record of what occurred at that meeting, because all you're doing is providing general information.
Or you can provide or collect proxies, right?
You don't even need proxies, because it doesn't matter how many people are there. And we'll talk about a proxy I'll talk about a proxy in a second, but correct, you don't need to worry about proxies, because you don't need to worry about quorum, which means you don't need to worry about how many people show up to officially call the meeting to order, because a town hall meeting is not for that purpose. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind, sort of tuck that away, and we'll come back to town halls just in just a couple minutes. So the first thing I want to talk about is annual meetings. And there are different types of communities, and probably we have board members that are on the webinar tonight that are from all different types of communities in Georgia. I'm assuming some of you are board members of condominiums, some might be board members of homeowner associations, and some might actually be board members of property owner associations. In each of these three different types of organizations, there are usually, I'm hoping, that all of you guys have bylaws for your associations. The types of things that I'm going to be talking about tonight are really found most of the time in the bylaws. So when you're looking for these things on your own, after we're done tonight and you want to go see, do your bylaws say anything about this? You're looking for the document that's called the bylaws of so-and-so, such and such community association Inc. And the first thing I'm going to mention is the fact that an annual meeting is supposed to happen at least once a year. A lot of your bylaws probably say it has to happen in the first quarter, or it needs to happen in October. Some bylaws actually say your annual meeting shall be the second Tuesday in November, or something really specific. The message I want you to hear tonight is that I really don't care what your bylaws say about when the meeting has to happen. Under Georgia law, you have to have an annual meeting at some point in time each year. It is not a disaster if you do not have your annual meeting at the exact moment that your bylaws say you must have the meeting. Frankly, if your meeting is supposed to be in October based on what your documents say, and you don't have it until December, who's going to sue you? And even if they do sue you, what are they suing you for? What damages do they have because your meeting is 2 months late? There really isn't a whole lot of worry associated with the timing of the meeting. It becomes more worrisome if you choose not to call an annual meeting for a period of years. That becomes more problematic. I just don't want you to get hung up on when your meeting's supposed to happen. And the reason I say that is because when Kathryn talks tonight about having elections electronically or by ballot outside of a meeting, we're going to talk about a lead time. She's going to be talking about 2 or 3 months getting ready in advance before that meeting is supposed to take place. So if your meeting's supposed to happen in August, we're already really late. Don't worry about it. What we're saying is your meeting's got to happen sometime this year. Jay already mentioned, even in the pandemic, you got to call an annual meeting. We're suggesting that it be virtual. So
2 quick things.
Please.
So one is that there's actually a Georgia statute that specifically says a date requirement in your bylaws for your annual meeting basically means nothing. Part of what we see all the time is you may hold your meeting at a time that's different than what the bylaws say. Some cranky owners are going to respond and say you can't do that. I like to point to the statute and say here it is, rather than just saying Jay, Jamie, and Kathryn said we can. Here's the statute. So important to know that there is a statute. The other important thing is we have an obligation to call an annual meeting, and you guys probably have seen this. There are years when you don't get a quorum. You can't conduct business. You technically still are holding an annual meeting. When you call an annual meeting and it starts at 7 o'clock, it is 7 o'clock and you don't have a quorum, your process is still to call the meeting to order. We don't have a quorum. We can't conduct business. You can then move on to informational things, but that is still technically a meeting. it means you should be taking minutes of that meeting, even though you don't have a quorum. And your minutes would be meeting convened, called to order at 7 o'clock, no quorum, no action conducted, closed at 7:30, whatever it may be. But it is still a meeting, and you satisfy your legal requirement to hold an annual meeting, even if you don't get a quorum.
So I want to actually comment on that, because even though you're calling the annual meeting and don't have a quorum, the reason that Jay is telling you that you should still keep minutes, even though there's nothing to take minutes of other than call the meeting, no quorum, adjourned. The reason that you want to keep minutes is so that we can show that we have a record, that the association, in fact, called the meeting, we gathered, we didn't have a quorum, we didn't take action. But we can show that the meeting was called and that people gathered together to have that meeting. And it's important to keep a record of that, even though there's no votes that are going to happen during that meeting time. So the other part, the next piece of this is, how do you notify owners that there's a meeting that's going to happen? And for an annual meeting, if you're a condo or a POA, your documents, your bylaws might tell you how much notice you have to give to your owners. If your documents don't say how much notice you must give, condos and POAs have to give at least 21 days notice before an annual meeting. And that notice is usually given in some form of writing. If you have email addresses for owners that you're permitted to use for official business of the association, you can send those notices via email if you want to. If there are some owners who don't have access to email, or you don't have their email address, you send those by written mail. If you have an address off-site for them, you would send that to wherever they live. Otherwise, you can send it to the property address. So if Jay has an email address but Kathryn doesn't, I can send Jay my annual meeting notice via email, but Kathryn, I'm going to have to send it to her by regular snail mail. And that's okay to divide up how you send your notice. You just want to make sure you send your annual meeting notice to every owner in your community, no matter where they live, no matter whether they're delinquent or owe you money, even if they're in violation of the association documents, they still get an annual meeting notice. So that piece, that notice requirement, is also the same for homeowner associations. You would check your bylaws and see if your bylaws say anything about notice if you're an HOA. But if the bylaws are silent and don't tell you how much notice you have to give, a homeowner association has to comply with the nonprofit corporate code, which requires between 10 and 60 days notice before the meeting, for an annual meeting. Either way, same exact rules apply as an HOA, as applied to condos and POAs, which is the notice has to be sent to every owner. You can send it via email. If you have their email, you can send it snail mail if you don't. So the notice requirement is sort of set up in your bylaws, or if not your bylaws, one of these 2 state laws or 3 state laws. The next piece of what I want to talk about really is, once you've sent your notice and you're at your meeting time, we're sitting there waiting for the start, you're waiting for people to come in and to register, to sign in. And you're counting the people who come in, because in all circumstances, you cannot conduct business as a corporation unless you have a quorum present at the beginning of your meeting. And a quorum, the word quorum means the number of people, the threshold number you have to get to in order to conduct business at that meeting. And a quorum can be different for almost any type of community. So again, I encourage you, check your bylaws. Your bylaws will usually have a quorum requirement. Some bylaws say 1/3 of eligible voters. Some bylaws say a majority of the total number of units in the condominium. The definition of quorum and how many people you need and how to calculate that number could be very different from community to community. So if you live in a condominium right now, but you came from a homeowner association 2 years ago where you used to live, the quorum requirement might be very different from community to community based on your bylaws. The nonprofit corporate code has established a quorum, and so does the Condominium Act and the Property Owner Association Act also. So again, you check your bylaws. If they're silent, you go to the law and figure out how to calculate those numbers. But almost all bylaws have quorum requirements. So you can't actually conduct business at a meeting if you don't have a quorum. And one of the things I want to talk about right now about quorum is, when do you say enough is enough? We're done waiting for enough people to show up to decide that we have a quorum. So if your meeting is called for 5:30, how long do you wait to collect registration, to collect people's signatures upon arrival, until you finally say, forget it, we don't have a quorum, we're going to move on and start the meeting and not vote on anything? And there's no definitive time frame that you're required by law to wait. It's really very dependent as a board of directors on the amount of flexibility you want to provide to your members. In my personal opinion, I think 15 minutes is long enough to wait. If they haven't shown up in a quarter of an hour after the meeting is supposed to start, I'm sorry, we're going to get started without you then. And if you get to that point and you start the meeting with no quorum, even if more people come in, they can stand there, they can be there, they can participate, they can talk if they can ask questions.
We'll even let them sit.
Yes, they can sit too, but they can't vote. If there's a vote that comes up the meeting, they don't get a ballot. They don't get a voice because they didn't show up on time. The reason that I'm telling you this is actually, I think, more important in the virtual world meeting than it is in person. In person, it's kind of easy, even at 6 o'clock, if they show up a half an hour late, to let them sign in and give them a ballot and have them sit down. It's not that big of a deal. But from the virtual perspective, it becomes way more cumbersome to be counting people who show up after we start the meeting. And Jay will get to that later, but understand that this is a really important point when your meeting converts to virtual from an in-person meeting. I'm not going to go into detail about how to establish a quorum and what the numbers are, because every community is going to be a little bit different. So go ahead and check your documents. If we're your attorneys, we're happy to help you figure that out. The next thing I want to talk about is proxies. And a proxy is a very misunderstood document. Jay hates proxies, so don't ever ask him about proxies. He doesn't like them. He thinks they're stupid. I don't particularly mind proxies, but I think they're problematic in a lot of ways. So a proxy is, I know that I am not going to be able to be at the meeting on July, what day is it? I don't even know what day it is. 25th, 2nd, 3rd, 22nd. On July 22nd. I'm not going to be able to show up at any point in time this evening. So I choose to give someone else authority to be me at the meeting. So I choose Kathryn. I'm not going to choose Jay because he doesn't like proxies, so I'm not going to even ask him. But I'm going to say,
and I'm not going to vote how you want.
Right, he's going to not vote the right way, because I'm always right. So I'll tell you though, what I would say to Kathryn is, listen, I can't be at the meeting. Will you show up and be me? And I want to be clear with you guys. A proxy does not have to have anything to do with your community unless your bylaws say so. The nonprofit corporate code requires the proxy be over 18 years of age, and that's it. They don't even have to live in Georgia. And they can be having nothing to do with your community. So most of your bylaws, however, will have additional qualifications. So most of your bylaws will say things like, the proxy holder has to be a member of our association or something of that nature. So you need to check your bylaws specifically. But I'd say to Kathryn, listen, I can't be at the meeting. Will you show up for me? I'll prepare a document. I will sign it. I will put her name on it that she has authority to act on my behalf. I'll say what meeting it's for, and I'll give it to her to bring with her. That's all fine and dandy for an in-person meeting. Because when Kathryn walks up to the registration table, she can plop down my proxy, she can sign in for herself, and then she can also sign in for me. She would obviously only sign in for herself if she's also a member of the corporation. Well, at a virtual meeting, I can't be collecting proxies via the chat at the beginning of the meeting. The proxy must be delivered to the association in advance so that we can register it as received, make sure it's correct and valid, and then allow Kathryn to show up for herself and for me. But if I don't submit that proxy in advance in the virtual meeting, it doesn't count. Kathryn can be on the call right now and say in the chat, but I have a proxy from Jamie. And Jay, the president of the association, is going to say, we don't care. We don't have it. You can't get it to us in time. We can't verify it. Thanks for letting us know, but it really doesn't matter. There are a lot of details about proxies. Jay said he might not vote the way I want him to. So if I gave him my proxy instead, and I tell him, listen, I only want you to vote for Kathryn for president, and he decides to vote for Chris, well, that's not what I told him to do, but he did it anyway. Is that valid? Is that not valid? It's very possibly valid that he votes whatever way he wants on my behalf, and tough luck on me. That's between me and Jay.
Completely valid.
Completely valid. I'm not going to go into why I think it might not be valid. That's beside the point. So, proxies in a virtual meeting, when we get to talking about how to get started with virtual meetings, not going to work unless you collect them in advance. The last piece that I want to mention is special meetings. Talked a little bit about the annual meeting. We talked about notice. We talked about quorum. We talked about proxies. I've already mentioned town halls. I'm going to mention a little bit about special meetings. The special meetings are the times when you need to conduct business with your membership, sometime between one annual meeting and the next. Now remember, if you are not planning to conduct business with your members, but you just want to talk to them, you're going to pass a special assessment and you're going to send everything out via mail or via email, but you want to talk with them about the project that you're doing and that you're collecting money for. That can be a town hall gathering. It doesn't have to be a special meeting. If you're not going to vote at the meeting on the special assessment, you don't need a special meeting. So keep in mind when you're deciding how you want to conduct business, if you're doing the conducting of the business via mail or email, you don't have to have an actual special or annual meeting to conduct that business. But if you want to talk to your members about stuff, plan it as a town hall. Special meeting has a little bit of a different notice requirement for condos and POAs, the same notice requirement for HOAs in the state laws. Your bylaws may be a little bit different. At a special meeting, again, you have to have a quorum, a certain number of people show up. And at that special meeting, you can only conduct business on whatever items are listed in your notice. So when you send that meeting notice out for a special meeting, if you say that you want the meeting to discuss a special assessment, and in your head you're planning to have a vote on it, that notice is not sufficient. The notice has to say discuss and vote. The verbs that you list in your special meeting notice really, really matter. So you can only conduct special business at your special meeting, and your special meeting notice has to describe the special business you want to conduct in a very special way. So I'm going to leave it at that for now. We're going to move on to our next subject matter, which is going to be Kathryn's. And I'm going to do my very best to shut up. And I'm not very good at that, but I'm going to really try hard.
Hey guys. Yeah, we'll see how long it takes for Jamie to interject. But she always has good things to say. So I am going to be talking to you guys a little bit about conducting elections outside of a meeting. And as Jay noted earlier, this is what we are recommending is that the easier approach is to basically conduct your elections outside of your annual meeting, and then if you have to host your annual meeting virtually. But as far as conducting elections outside of a meeting, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to run through a few items discussing the legal authority first as to whether we can conduct elections outside of a meeting. And then we'll go through the particular methods that you can use to conduct your elections. And then I'll go through the notice and the procedural requirements and the recommended steps. in order to accomplish all this.
Okay, I'm already interrupting you.
Okay.
And I'm only interrupting because my eyes are really bad and I couldn't read the 2 questions that were asked of me, but they're really on my section, so it'll be easier to get them out of the way.
Okay.
So the first question is about recording your meeting, and that's a really poor choice. Do not record your meetings. It's not a good idea because the entire recording then becomes a discoverable record by any other association member and in court. And so you really don't want to be recording them. You want the minutes of the meeting to reflect what votes took place, and nothing should replace the minutes. Do not record your minute. Your
And
minutes.
if I could piggyback on that, people ask about recording board meetings or letting owners record. You should be making rules not to allow this, because with the knowledge that we're being recorded, all of us naturally are going to not be as frank and open in our discussion, which ultimately hurts the business. It impedes our ability to make decisions if we can't have full, frank discussion. So recording in itself, not great. I know we're recording this, but we've been very careful and we've practiced this. But for your meetings, even if you are on a platform that records and you want to use that for transcribing minutes from, do that and delete the recording immediately. If you have it, it is an association record. It is reviewable and discoverable.
Exactly. The second question that I'm going to address is what happens if you don't have a quorum for your annual meeting? How do you vote on stuff? And you don't. If there is no quorum, there is no vote. So the specific question was, what about your budget?
Until we get into mine.
The specific question was about budgeting, and Jay will talk about the budgeting process and stuff. But very briefly, if your owners are allowed to potentially veto the budget at your annual meeting, and they don't have enough people show up to have a quorum, they can't veto the budget. Tough luck. If they cared enough or were that upset about the budget that you provided to them, enough of them would have shown up to have a quorum and to be able to veto. So you're in good shape with that. We'll talk about how the budget should be voted on a little bit later. Sorry, I'm really sorry.
Thanks, Jay. Okay, so getting back to elections outside of a meeting. Basically, the first step with anytime you're going to try to conduct your elections outside of a meeting is to determine if you've got the legal authority to do so. The way that you do that is you would look to your bylaws. Your community bylaws are going to basically provide a provision that it'll usually be titled action outside of a meeting. And it's in the membership section usually of your bylaws. And you look there to see if you are permitted to take action outside of a meeting, which most bylaws are going to have this authority. A lot of the time you will see separate provisions. There are 2 different ways that you can take action outside of a meeting, through either a consent form or a ballot voting form. Sometimes you'll have both provisions in your bylaws, but most of the time, most communities are going to have this authority. You want to check just in case, because there is the rare occurrence where we see that there's a specific provision that says you cannot take action outside of a meeting, or it's limiting and it effectively does not allow you to take action outside of a meeting because it requires some certain threshold, like 100% of the owners have to actually consent. That's usually in the consent provision, so it's not going to apply to us. But the key here is just to check your bylaws and see if your bylaws are silent. If they don't say anything about taking action outside of a meeting, the good thing is that the law in Georgia, the nonprofit corporate code, basically allows communities to take action outside of a meeting. So you're good there too if your bylaws are silent. So that's step 1, assuming that you do have the authority to take action outside of a meeting. The step 2 is we need to determine what method we want to use to conduct our elections. And there are several that I'm going to discuss. The first option, of course, is the mail-in ballot. It's your paper ballot. I mean, a lot of communities still take advantage of this, even though they do communicate electronically with some of their members. Some just find it easier to send out a paper ballot, and that's the method that they choose to pursue, and it's great. It works for a lot of communities. But basically, you're preparing this ballot voting form and you're sending it out to the owners and requesting that they return it with their casting their vote. There's certain requirements for ballots, you can usually sometimes your bylaws will dictate what those are. They'll tell you what they are, and then the law and order provides. Some of them specifically are, your ballot has to set forth the proposed action, which is, your voting, your election, and what you're voting on the candidates to be elected. You have to specify the time by which the ballot has to be returned, and then you also need to indicate the number of responses that are needed in order to meet the quorum requirements, which is something that Jamie touched on earlier. Even when you're taking action outside of a meeting, you still have to meet quorum. And the way that works is you basically have to receive the number of voting forms. People have to return the number of voting forms that equals your quorum. So if you have, for instance, a 25% quorum requirement, 25% of the eligible voters in the association, then you have to receive at least 25 voting forms returned to you that are actually casting a vote, or also probably vote. You just have to receive that number in order to meet the quorum. If you don't receive that number, if you don't meet the quorum, then your election is not valid. So that's definitely a key point that you want to keep in mind there. Moving on, so an additional method of conducting your elections is to do so electronically. And Jamie touched on this a little bit earlier, but most of the time, most communities are going to have the authority to communicate electronically, but every now and then you might have a provision in your bylaws or your declaration that doesn't allow you to do so. So you just want to check the authority just to make sure that you can communicate electronically. Most can. It's very rare, I think, that we see provisions that would actually prohibit something like that. So in that case, assuming you do, we see kind of a mix, when you communicate via email with a lot of your owners, it certainly is easy to send out your ballot voting forms by email. And one thing that we recommend to a lot of our clients is that you make that voting form a PDF, basically a fillable document. And so that makes it a lot easier for the owners to return it by email, because, all they're having to do is enter the information and simply, one click and it gets back to you. If you don't do the fillable version, that's fine, but it's just people have to print it out, they have to fill it out, print it, scan it, send it back to you. So it can be a process with that, but there are different options that you can pursue, but basically email is a really good and efficient way to do so. One thing I will caution you on is that if and I think Jamie did touch on this earlier a bit, but the owners have to basically consent to communicate electronically. So if somebody has not consented to communicate electronically, you don't have their email address, then you still have to send certain owners a paper ballot to whatever address that they have on file as their record address. So it may be that you have a community full of owners who've all agreed to email, and that's great. And I think that would be a really good option for a community like that. But just keep in mind that you still have to accommodate those who do not have an email, who don't wish to communicate electronically. And then the final method of conducting your elections outside of a meeting is there are these third-party voting websites. And they're great because they allow, there's just this platform that allows you to consolidate all of your voting information. People just go to the website, they click on it, there's certain instructions, and then they cast their vote. And the website, the people who run the website, basically they compile the information and get it to you. And it's a relatively simple process once you get the hang of it. I think when you do it for the first time, we can probably attest to that when you're looking at it for the first time, it's a lot, it can be a lot to understand, and you've got to upload all your information onto the website in order to give them the information for your ballot form and all of that. But once you do it the first time, what we've heard from a lot of our clients is that after that first time, they really like doing it because they understand it. It's simple, it's easy. But again, with the voting website, you may not be able to require everybody to use it if they haven't consented electronically.
So good question came in
Okay.
from somebody. If we're doing this ballot method, mail-in ballot, not one of the websites, do we have to have them return it by USPS, or can we use other methods like email, fax?
Yeah.
So how can they return it?
Oh, how can they return it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, well, your bylaws are gonna basically say how you can communicate and how you can return it, but I mean, you can definitely, I mean, you can usually return it. And what you will do is when you prepare the ballot, you're gonna provide the methods to which it can be returned. But if I'm understanding the question
Can we
correctly.
say email your ballots to Kathryn?
Yes, and that's right. So you can you detail in the ballot form how you want it to be returned.
I also think, though, that even if you tell them that they, here's an envelope to return it back to us via mail, and they scan it and email it back to you, that's perfectly fine too. They just have to get it back to you by the deadline.
Sure.
So remember that the method of delivery is really not relevant to how they're voting. If they just type you an email and say, I vote this way, that might be problematic because that's not on the ballot, it's not signed, etc. But if they fill in the information and then email it back to you via, scan it and email it, that's totally fine. They don't have to send it back by mail just because you sent it to them by mail. They don't have to send it back by email just because you sent it to them by email. So method of delivery is almost irrelevant.
Right.
And we'll talk about this a little more when we get to the virtual, but one of the things that we need to remember, whether we're talking about proxies or things delivered like this, we generally have authority under the corporate code to reject things that we think are not valid, fraudulent or otherwise. Frankly, we've seen them, clear ones over the years, fake proxies and other things. One of the reasons I like the voting in this method for directors and other things is that people vote themselves directly, and we have greater security control over the methodology. So we'll talk about that more. But one of the beauties of this ballot method or the online method, whatever you choose, is that we completely control the timeline, the platform, the communications, the delivery methods, all how we want, and all to give us enough time to accommodate doing our job, our roles in this process. So yeah, more.
When Jay's saying our, he doesn't mean like our law firm, but like your role as the board, as the association.
Melissa's, because Melissa's going to do it all.
Right.
But
Yeah. So on that note, I think that's a good segue. So basically, after we have determined how we want to conduct the methods for conducting the elections, I think it's important to look at, how basically preparing a timeline. That's something that Jay just mentioned, but you're going to, because this process, we're not just calling an annual meeting and we're voting. It can take a little bit longer because we've got to accommodate some of the other procedures that would otherwise have occurred at the annual meeting, such as nominations. So, we have to make sure that we cover all of our bases. And for that reason, we're going to create this timeline that basically outlines the different steps and the communications to the members that is going to explain to them not only, this is the voting process, we're going to call for nominees to the board, and we're going to do basically making sure that we're going to get all of everything covered in the right amount of time. The only real time limitation that we have when conducting elections outside of a meeting is that we have to allow the members to, the amount of time that we have to allow the members to vote needs to really coincide with the notice requirement for an annual meeting. So I think Jamie touched on this earlier, but for instance, if your annual meeting notice requirement is 21 days, then we recommend that you basically allow your owners at least 21 days to cast their ballots, to submit their voting form. So that really is the only time frame that we're looking at, the only real time requirement. So with that in mind, we've prepared a sample timeline for you guys. And I just want to go through it real quick just to kind of give you an idea of how we see this working and what we have seen works best for our clients. So at step one, basically boards are going to want to start planning and preparing for this process. And by that, I mean, you're going to want to draft up your notice to the community that says, hey, look, we're getting ready to conduct our elections. We're going to conduct it separately from the annual meeting. This is how we see it working. Whether it's through a third-party website or we're just going to mail out ballots. It's basically an explanatory letter just telling them how it's going to work. In that same letter, you want to call for nominations to the board. So that's the first step in that process. And with that letter, you typically, you want to give yourself as a board enough time, and your manager and your attorneys, if you are utilizing your attorney for some part of this, some time to do that. So 3 to 4 weeks is not unreasonable to think, that's a good planning period. There's no limitation on this. It can be at your discretion, whatever you think is sufficient to get everything done. But that's, and just as a note on this timetable, this is probably a longer time period in between each date that we've given you than some people will need, but it's just a basic guideline. Use it as you will, but something that certainly gives you a sufficient amount of time, hopefully, to complete each of these steps. So after you've prepared your initial community notice letter and you've called for the nominations, your next step is going to be to mail or email the notice letter out, and you're going to want to establish a deadline for people to submit their the nominations to the board. One form that we have prepared for our clients in the past that we find helpful is a candidate application form, and it's just basically, it's a form. It provides a uniform way for people to submit their information as nominees, some biographical information specifically. And I think in this process where you're conducting your election outside of a meeting, where you are not going to have the forum at the annual meeting for people to introduce themselves, that you do ask people to submit some sort of biographical information, something that tells the community a little bit about themselves, assuming not everyone knows anyone. Even if you do, it's just helpful because you don't otherwise have the opportunity to get that out there. Sometimes some communities will take an extra step here, and they'll call a town hall meeting to basically just introduce the nominees to everyone. But in a time like this, when we're dealing with a pandemic, I think that's probably not going to be an option right now, and certainly not required. So I think it's good to maybe encourage people who want to run for the board to submit some information. And doing that through a candidate application form is certainly a good way. So after you've established that you have received your the nominations, basically at that point you're going to want to create your voting form or get everything that you need together for the third-party voting website. So you're going to want to prepare the voting form, and then probably an additional communication letter to the community telling them, look, here is the voting form, this is how it's going to work, here's the deadline to return the voting form, and the methods by which you will return the voting form. Let's see. And so, when you send out that next communication, you can send out the nominees' biographies or whatever information they give you too. So it's a packet of information you're going to be sending out through that second communication to the members. And then, of course, like I said, you're going to establish that deadline to cast your votes. You want to give at least the amount of time, like I said, that is required for notice for an annual meeting. Here we've given definitely a little bit more time than that, but essentially, once you have that deadline set, in between the date that you set to return the voting forms and the date of your annual meeting, which you don't necessarily have to announce your election result at the meeting. You can send it out separately before the annual meeting, whatever you want to do, because it is separate. But a lot of communities actually do. They just find it helpful to send out to announce the results at the annual meeting. Of course, if there are people at the annual meeting, some members that don't show up, you still have to send out a notice to those who weren't at the meeting of the results. But you do want to give yourself just a few days at least in between the deadline to return the voting forms and the date that you're going to send out the date of your annual meeting, so that you have enough time to count the votes and make sure that everything is straight before you come up with your final tally and prepare the results. So with that said, so that's the basic timeline that we usually recommend. And I talked about several documents that you'll want to prepare. So it's important to make sure that you have everything ready and that you give yourself enough time so you're not stressed trying to get everything out and get everything going. And I think I've pretty much covered everything. I don't know if we have any.
We have some
additional
questions that kind of tie into the next part, so I think I might cover those.
Okay.
I want to just make one comment about the timeline. Normally, when you're trying to put together your timeline, you start with when you think you want your annual meeting to be, and then you kind of work backwards. The timeline that we're providing you adds a lot of time in between each of the sections so that you can get everything done that you need to get done, which is really important that you leave yourself enough time. But usually you don't start from the top, you usually start from the bottom and then add in dates going back to the top. So you usually start with your annual meeting date and then work your way backwards.
An important point. So, and I might back up a little bit to start with this, to make sure we were clear about this, that this concept of ballot voting or voting on one of the many voting platforms, the websites that accommodate it, which are great, but they cost money. They're hard to set up, at least initially. Huge value in that they do all the counting and manage all the registration, but either one of those are not our annual meetings. The corporate code has two provisions that legal mumbo jumbo, they are different mechanisms, but they basically allow you to conduct business that you can conduct at a meeting completely without a meeting. And when we're talking about this ballot or a written consent method, whether that is an online ballot or whether it is a mailed-in ballot, we are not talking at all about the annual meeting. This operates completely independently from that. The timeline we've provided and the way we've discussed this they've contemplated what normally happens, and we've done these dozens, hundreds of times, that we plan this to coordinate the elections to happen before the annual meeting. So you walk into the annual meeting, elections are done, you can announce results, and you do your other annual meeting business. And I'll talk about that. But you don't have to do that at all. This could be done completely separate from the annual meeting and months ahead of the annual meeting or even after your annual meeting. This election part by ballot is separate. And it ties back to that under the corporate code, there is only one reason we must have annual meetings. We're required to have them, but only one single piece of business has to happen at annual meetings. And that is present an annual financial state of the union to members. Present our P&L, present our budgets. That's the only requirement to happen under the code for annual meetings. Now, our documents try to combine other things into that. The elections. We got a couple of questions about budget adoption. Few communities have a provision that require members to actually approve a budget each year. More often, the members get a right to veto it. But those are usually written to tie into the annual meeting. The members at the annual meeting may veto the budget. The members at the annual meeting may make nominations from the floor for director candidates. The code letting us do those pieces of business separately means that we can essentially ignore those provisions in our documents that say it has to be done at the annual meeting. So in this methodology, we've had some questions about other things like the budget voting. We've talked about this, conducting your election of directors completely separate from your annual meeting. I think it makes sense because, frankly, every single person over a longer window of time than our 2-hour annual meeting has a right to directly vote. And more importantly, we get to control the security on how we manage that registration and voting. But if we have any other business that we would normally do at our annual meeting that we can only do if we can get the owner vote, whether it's we need a special assessment, we need them to approve a loan, us borrowing, whether it's amendments to the documents, or whether we need approval for the budget in those few communities that require it. If we have affirmative things where we need them to vote, all of those can and should be pulled out of the annual meeting parts and put into this balloting method. I call it the Kathryn voting method. Whether you do it on a website through one of the services or whether we create our own application, some board members are sophisticated enough to do that, or whether we just do it by paper that we deliver by mail electronically and they sign and send back. Whatever that is, conduct your voting separately. We can do that virtually at a meeting, at the annual meeting, but it's ridiculously complicated because I'm going to talk about how to do the annual meeting, what's left of it after you do this balloting, the Kathryn voting. It's still complicated and difficult. If you add elections to it, much more involved. So if you've done this process of the elections, you've solicited nominations, you've gotten back people's nominations and bios, from the very beginning, our communication should lay out to everybody exactly how it's going to work. Minimize the questions. We're going to conduct voting separately. We will have an annual meeting later. It may only be informational and no voting, but we'll have that virtually. For this voting for the elections, you must submit us your bios by this time, your nominations, your bios. We always do this. You should be doing this today. We will distribute the bios. We may hold a town hall forum to meet the candidates. We reserve the right to scrub your bios so that we can remove things that are factually inaccurate or offensive. We see them all the time. Bios come in, elect me because I won't steal the money like the current board of directors. Well, no way we are sending that bio in, obviously. So reserve our rights to do that. Package our bios and the method for voting using either of these methods Kathryn talked about. The quorum is established, like Jamie and Kathryn said, by those that are returned. We count those, and if that adds up to our quorum, our vote is official. If it doesn't add up to our quorum, then we have no election of directors. We can choose to do it again, or just like we do with annual meetings where we get no quorum, the corporate code and most of our bylaws say our current directors continue in office until someone else is elected. And we may have documents that allow them to serve until the end of the next term, basically re-up for a whole term. Some may say till the next annual meeting, but we, just like with annual meetings, can take that vote if we didn't get a quorum, say it failed, the current directors continue. Thank you for your participation. We announce the results, we move on. For the annual meeting, if we do that, then what is left at the annual meeting is we've got to provide our financial reports. They are paper. We know we talk about them at annual meetings live, but essentially they are paper. We're going to distribute that paper anyway. So the annual meeting financial reports then can be, we've provided in your package our balance sheet, P&L, budget, comparison to last year. That's out there. Now our treasurer, our managing agent's going to do a 15-minute, very high-level recap on it. We may put it up again, just like we have this document. Most of these platforms for virtual meetings allow you to upload documents. We're going to have it here in case you didn't get it in the mail. You can download it at your convenience, but we're going to do that summary. And then, like regular annual meetings, there are two other things that we generally have to accommodate. People may have questions, and people, if we have that provision where we present a budget and that budget goes into effect unless the members veto it, we have to anticipate the possibility that somebody makes the motion to veto our budget. So most of, really all of us have probably used Zoom, Teams, GoToMeeting, WebEx, others for these video conferences. These meetings. They are meetings. When we do this, if we are at an annual meeting today in exactly this platform, we are conducting a meeting, following meeting protocols and requirements. And we can choose to allow ourselves to be the presenters, and those people, the homeowners who come in, to be there, to not, just like you are now, not be on video, not be on audio, but we still have to accommodate the ability for people to make motions and comments. So we have to build that in. But if we're going to do this process with the annual meeting virtually, a lot of this is set up back in the notice that Kathryn discussed, talking about the election. And it will be the notice both for the annual meeting and the election. One thing to keep in mind is that under the corporate code, generally, we can't go longer than 60 days in our notice. Jamie talked about the minimum amount of notice we can give for an official meeting, but there's also a maximum in the code. If we start this process 90 days beforehand, which we think you should, we still need to send an official notice of the annual meeting within 60 days of that. And it may just be our follow-up reminder to people about what's next in the process of elections. And oh, by the way, again, the Zoom, the GoToMeeting annual meeting will be on this date. And we will have completed these voting items separately at the meeting. We'll review the budget, we'll present financials, we'll allow some time for Q&A and for new business.
So can I comment about that?
Yes.
When you're doing a virtual annual meeting and you're creating this notice that's going to go with the notice that's essentially the same as the notice for the election, the way you do this is that you set up your date and your time, and your location essentially is the meeting ID for either the Zoom call or the WebEx call or the GoToMeeting or Teams, whatever meeting ID you're going to use to have people log on, that's your location of your meeting in your meeting notice when you go to a virtual meeting, annual meeting. Just want to say that.
Yeah. So now, when you're doing this meeting, and this ties back to the notice, we do a meeting and we're required to do the things we normally do in meetings. We have to check people in. We have to recognize voting. We have to take minutes. We may record it and transcribe and then delete the video, but we need to take minutes. We should have an agenda. Very important that the agenda go out in the packages early, so it's very clear to people what we are and are not doing at the meeting. We should time those pieces so that we can move on in business as people raise hands at wrong times or continue to want to try to talk or monopolize the meeting. But I'll talk about checking in the process, but let's go back to this concept of the proxy. I don't hate proxies. I don't like proxies. But here's the issue with the proxy, and particularly in an environment like this. One, honestly, it's so easy for people to defraud us with proxies. Two, all a proxy does is tell us, you are legally required to recognize Jamie as me. Whatever Jamie does at the meeting to make a fool of herself, not that she ever does, is me essentially doing that. She's doing it for me. It's not anything more than that. The reality of this whole idea of voting, let's say electing directors at an annual meeting. Our annual meeting is December 15th from 7 o'clock to 9 o'clock. Great, my kids have some school event, I'm out. If you can't be there, you can provide somebody a proxy. Okay, great, I can give Jamie a proxy and wish for the best that she does what I want to do at the meeting.
Good luck.
Good luck. That concept really makes no sense. If what you need from me and what I want to be enfranchised is the ability to vote on Kathryn as my director, I should be able to do that directly. And this method is the best way to allow that, so that she directly votes for me and has a big window of time to do it. 21 days, 15 days, whatever that time period is we allow. So there's really no reason to use proxies if we're accommodating my ability to vote directly on those things that we, the board, are putting out for a vote. Now, there can be voting at this meeting still. Someone still may stand up and say, I make a motion to veto the budget, if that's what our documents allow. If our documents allow, they may stand up and say, I make a motion to throw Jay out on his butt, remove him from the board. That is legally permitted at a meeting unless our bylaws say you can't. So we have to accommodate that. But if the only voting, even possible voting, that is left at this virtual annual meeting is stuff that is essentially an obstruction to us effectively doing our jobs and operating in the community. We established a budget because we thought it was right with the information that we have. If there is a vote to veto the budget, it's a vote to undermine what we have spent considerable time putting together because that's our legal duty as a board. There is no reason for us to enable that vote, but also letting people use proxies for these virtual meetings. Virtual annual meeting, unless we are the rare community where our bylaws say you must distribute proxies, you should not use proxies for this. The proxy also will make check-in and voting much more complicated, but the method of conducting these meetings should be each one of you is personally invited. Now, we know just like this that people can share the links to get in. Jamie mentioned your notice or a notice should be, you're going to be able to participate in the annual meeting via Zoom. We're going to conduct a Zoom conference or a GoToWebinar conference. And people will share that. And my wife, Susie, and I may be on together on different devices. I may be at work still, and she may be at home, and we both may be on. That makes this concept of check-in and voting very complicated. One of the values of the website piece where we're voting through this platform of web voting, and there are a number of them that do that, is that they're going to collect email addresses for us. They register by email. We probably have email addresses from many of our owners, but we know we don't from everyone. In this process, our greatest tool for security to manage the voting and to manage the registration, the check-in, is to require registration through name, address, and email address. And we'll explain to everybody, or we should, one vote per home. You both are welcome to be on the conference, but for purposes of check-in and voting, we are going to distribute an email to everybody who notifies us you want to participate in this by email and gives us an email address. And you will register using that. And when you come in as a user, you must, to vote, sign in with your name and that email address that's registered. We then will use that for counting if there is a vote at all. The obvious consequence of this method is this takes a lot of administration and time on us. And I think that the answer to all of that is, think about it, check-in. So if we call our meeting for 7 o'clock, Heritage has to manage that, just like checking at a live meeting, manage those people in and figure out who is actually a registered, authorized voter and not Susie and I together. Scrub all of that out. That's going to take some time. That verification can happen while we're doing some reports and announcements, introductions. And for those introductions, I think that just like we are now, Most likely it will be on separate devices and screens, but we, the board, just like we sit at a table up front in an annual meeting, we should all be up on this screen, viewable. We may be individually mic'd so that the speaker has the mic, but we should be there to show the members that we are there and involved. While we're doing our presentation on whatever it may be, informational stuff, Heritage can be verifying our quorum. We are meeting. If we're going to have any voting, we must have a quorum. So we can start the process, get Heritage time to do that, and then your manager can say, board, let me chime in for a second. I just want to let you know that we do or we do not have a quorum. And then we respond just like at other meetings with what that means. Sorry, everyone, we don't have a quorum. It means that we can't conduct any voting, but we're going to continue information. Or we do have a quorum. If anything comes up that's a voting item, we'll explain again how we conduct the voting, but it'll basically be through this one of these platforms we talk about. So we move on, we do our presentation. If we are one of those communities, you should be doing this at your live meetings now, where it says we present the budget and the budget stands unless the members veto it. We should never call for a vote. It's not our job to ask them if they want to shoot down what we spent 2 months accomplishing. Instead, we give them a little time to see if someone makes a motion to veto, and if not, we move on with business. How would they make a motion? How would they ask a question about anything? Well, the platforms are different, but they all have essentially a similar functionality, which is either a chat function, a question function, or a hand raise. We would instruct people, look, if you have questions, raise your hand. Someone, Jamie's doing it right now with yours, someone will monitor the questions and Jamie can stop the group and say, board, we have a motion from John Smith to veto the budget. We know technically motions require a second, but frankly, that's stupid. Just go on. We could ask someone to raise their hand for a second, but if somebody has made a motion that's a legitimate, valid motion on something they have a right to vote on, then just like at an annual meeting, we have to accommodate that vote. Now, there are, again, many things that they typically can vote on, but that budget one is one for most communities. Most of those provisions say that to actually veto the budget, a majority of the entire association must vote, yes, I veto the budget. If Heritage has said, you know what, we have 300 homes, that would take 151. We have a quorum, but you only have 100 people participating. Well, then we can't conduct that vote, and we politely say, thank you, John Smith, but we can't conduct that vote because it requires this threshold, that many aren't participating. If there are enough people to conduct that vote, or any other that they raise their hands for, they make a motion for, we have a couple of options in how we do it. And I think that we work with whichever method we choose, whether it's raise your hand, whether it's send us your vote by chat. Yes, I veto, no, I don't veto. We can pick whatever is easier for us. We work with the easier to count one first. And let's say it's the budget vote in that case. So if we are going to conduct that vote, I would say, okay, we had a motion to conduct a vote. We're required to have a little discussion. We can do that by giving people the mic individually. Frankly, I personally don't like that. We've done that in meetings. I would rather have them put their discussion in a chat that our gatekeeper can manage, just like we manage people raising their hand and we call on them. And then we restate it, but we can give them the mic and let them talk for a minute and then mute them when they're done. Go through that, we call the vote, and then I like the reverse. And I say, we're going to vote on whether to veto the budget. It requires 150 people to say, yes, I want to veto the budget. And in that case, if that passes, we go back to last year's budget. Because that's such a high threshold, and while we have more people, we have enough people to accommodate that vote, it's going to require such a large percentage of us. We're going to take the no vote first, because it may only take 10 people to vote no and this vote fails. So by raising the hand, will you, for those of you, we're going to vote, those of you who vote no to vetoing the budget, please raise your hand now. Jamie is our gatekeeper. Please give us the results. Or Heritage is our gatekeeper. Okay, the results are we had 11 people vote no. This motion fails. We move on. Now, time-wise, that was fairly easy to accomplish. We conducted the voting. For our record, we could, like we take minutes, record that we had 11 no votes, not even take the yes vote, because it's irrelevant at that point. But what all of these applications allow us to do, platform, is record that either through screenshot, or some will actually let you report on that exactly. Report all the chat, report the hand raises. Save that as our record. Screenshot those no votes, and that becomes our record. We then handle this kind of voting very easily. If we get to more complicated voting, like in theory, I mentioned this, we could vote on directors right now at this annual meeting and allow them to make statements, conduct the voting. Extremely complicated to elect three people up for election. We have 5 candidates. Vote for no more than 3. We could hand raise for each person and count. We could chat. Everybody type your up to 3 people. In that case, we could absolutely do that. It is possible. The timing and the consumption of resources is tremendous. Room for error. So if you absolutely want to do that, the best method to do it is to have that vote and tell everybody, we are going to conduct the vote, but we will not be counting and announcing the results at this meeting. We will do that, just like at a regular meeting, with a team of people that are a fair, unbiased group. Has to be some of us, because we have to make sure, obviously, that our election is valid, but we'll appoint other election inspectors who are non-board members to help. And tomorrow or the next day, we will do the counting among this group, and we will announce results by email and mail. Remove that entire process from this meeting so that the meeting can be as simple as possible. So then we roll through these business items. We may have not had any vote whatsoever. There may be no motion to veto the budget. We may have done the Kathryn director elections. We may have done our presentations. And now we're at the time of the meeting where we do normal Q&A. This is where it's really important to have a timed agenda. To say, look, we have 23 minutes left for Q&A. It's going to be done in this method. We have some questions that have come in. Send them in now. The gatekeeper, Heritage, Jamie, will manage those. We'll try to answer as many as we can. If we don't, your comments and your opinions are important to us. You're always welcome to get to us after this meeting. Reach out to Heritage. But we're going to handle individual questions. Our gatekeeper then is able to, 1, filter out the nonsense, but 2, select from those questions the ones that we think we may not have really as well as we want addressed in our presentation, or that we think we need to answer politically. We can manage the questions because we have the questions. So it is very possible that we get through this annual meeting, if we've done the Kathryn voting method, and we have no vote, and maybe we have a couple of questions just like this, and we're done and we're out, and our meeting is done in an hour. I believe we've had communities use this method for years and years, and what they find is it is hard the first time you do it because it's new. After that, once you develop the platform and you've created your form notices, your form requests for candidate nominations and bios, your form ballot for the elections, and then this methodology for the annual meeting, it gets much easier, and I think you're never going to go back. No community that I have ever worked with that has done this method has said, you know what, we just want to go back to doing the whole thing and completely out of control, everybody together in a gym or library annual meeting. This is going to be how you do it. This, while the pandemic is hugely frightening, if there is a positive, it is forcing us to look at these methods that others have been using for years and are so much more effective, so much more efficient. At the end of it all, you close your annual meeting. If we have announcements, you do your announcements. And then I think that even if there is no voting at the annual meeting, at every annual meeting, you should put out a communication to your members afterwards saying thank you to everybody for participating. We think it was fantastic. We had great comments, great questions. If you still have questions, feel free to reach out to Heritage. But we appreciate, and I've been known to embellish, even if we get no comments whatsoever, thanks from people afterwards, that this was easier and helpful and thanks for it. Our message to people should be thanks for all the positive comments about how we conducted it in this method, and your continued support of the board, always. That should be your message, always. And honestly, I think it is real. If we have 300 members, we know we have 10 who are going to complain if you want to hand them a $20 bill. But if 280 are not communicating to us, it's because they're happy or okay. And that's good. That's, in my mind, that's support. Okay, we are going to allow questions.
There are two questions that I wanted to touch on that seem to be consistently an issue. One was nominations from the floor. The second one was about how you count your owners to determine if you have a quorum, like on the virtual meeting, how do you physically do that? And then the third one, I remember there was a third one. There seems to still be, there are a couple of people who have in the chat indicated questions still about approving the budget. How do you approve the budget? And I want to be really, really clear about this. Many board members have a complete misunderstanding about how the budget is supposed to be approved. Many of you think that the owners are supposed to vote to approve the budget. And in almost all of your community documents, it is the exact opposite. It is the board adopts the budget as a vote of the board members. You send out the budget to the owners, and usually most of your documents will say the members at the annual meeting have the right to veto it. But if you don't get a quorum to your annual meeting, they can't vote to veto. And if they don't have the right number of people there to veto, they don't get to veto, which means you've got a budget that passed and no veto of it. So you're golden. Real quickly, please.
This is actually even a bigger issue. The corporate code gives members very few voting rights. Elect you sometimes, throw you out, and terminate the whole thing. Our documents may give them more rights than that, but generally, whether it's adopting the budget or whether it's making a decision not to open your gym or pool yet, it is not typically a member decision. It is your decision, and if things go wrong, it is a board and corporate liability. We get sued, not Kathryn as a homeowner who shows up once every 4 years for an annual meeting. The authority is in us to make those decisions unless our documents specifically say we have to have a vote of the owners. Okay, nominations from the floor. I think I meant to talk about this, but didn't. So the code allowing us to conduct everything by ballot, I believe, takes that completely away. That said, the best way to address this, to avoid even the questions from homeowners who want to question everything, those few that want to question everything, is when we get to this method of voting and we put out a ballot by paper, or we've used one of these voting sites and we've identified our 5 candidates who submitted nominations, just leave spots for write-ins. Leave 2 blank write-in options, and it, in my mind, completely replaces any possibility or need for floor-type nominations. If I decide after this entire process, but before the end of it, that I want to run, but I didn't nominate myself, I can go on my own campaign and tell people to vote for me and write myself in. And it will accomplish the same thing as if I did that at the floor of the meeting. That's the method.
The other thing I wanted to mention about the nominations from the floor is that the reason why a lot of your bylaws have the availability of nominations from the floor is because also your bylaws usually say that there shall be a nominating committee to nominate people to the board. And in addition to the nominating committee, the people who write the bylaws want the ownership, the members, to feel like they're empowered to suggest someone else for the nomination, not just the people the nomination committee decides. So I also have a similar opinion to Jay in the sense that if you're taking this outside
Which
of the
is
meeting,
shocking.
I know, shocking. It's a miracle. I agree with Jay. I have the same opinion that if you're doing this action outside of the meeting, which you're entitled to do, you essentially don't need to worry about nominations from the floor. And the reason I think you don't have to worry about nominations from the floor is because you are giving everyone the opportunity to nominate anyone they want.
Right, you're doing
in
it
this process, you're letting them nominate anyone by notifying them
from their own floor, whether it's
from
the
their own
kitchen,
house.
the bedroom.
Exactly. So you're already accomplishing the goal that is met by the nomination from the floor by using Kathryn's method, saying in advance, hey, nominate anybody, and then we'll send out all the nominations to everybody. So you're already accomplishing that goal. The last thing that I wanted to bring up before we open it for more questions, if there are any, is how do you actually figure out if there's a quorum? And I gotta tell you, this can be a nightmare, and it is a nightmare if the person who's facilitating the actual meeting, changing the slides and schmoozing with everyone when they first get on, if that person's role is also to establish or determine a quorum, you're in trouble. You have to have someone devoted and distinctly associated with figuring out if there's a quorum, and that's their only job. They sit there just like you would at a regular in-person meeting with a list of all the members.
They manage the voting if you have it.
And they identify who's eligible to vote and who's not, already done on their list, highlighted it or whatever. And as people sign in, we say out loud over and over again, if you've just joined our call, please put your name and address in the chat. If you've just joined our call, please put a name, or you share a screen that has like the wording of that on the screen. So as they sign in, they see the screen, and then they put into the chat their name and address. So if I'm the person who's the gatekeeper determining a quorum, I am seeing that Jay Lazega signed in with his address, and I also see that Susie Lazega signed in, with her address. And when I go to sign them both in with their address and their name, I realize, oh, they're from the same property, and I only check that off as signed in as once. And then at some point in time, my deadline, my Jamie deadline is 15 minutes. At 15 minutes, I count who signed in based on my little piece of paper that I have in my house while I'm sitting there watching everyone on the chat signing in. And I determine whether there's a quorum or not. It's exactly the same as if I was physically sitting at a table and people were walking into the meeting, but instead I'm just looking at who's on the chat, and they have to put their name and address in the chat so I can determine, check them off on my box, decide if they count, because if they can't vote, they often can't count, and then I can count them up and then say yes or no, we have a quorum.
And I take it even a step further and force a registration, an
Right.
email, because in subsequent years, that's going to make everything a lot easier.
Because you'll have their email.
And we can start using that for communications and get out of USPS and other things. But and many of you have used these applications, from the organizer perspective, almost every one of these applications has functionality that allows us to see the attendees.
Yeah.
So they may get on, and Susie may get onto most of her Zoom calls, and her name on the Zoom call is Cute Susie, but from the administrator site, she may log in, register, and we would say, you must use your name, address, and then register your email address, and we can confirm where they're coming in from, who they are, and then use that to filter. We can, if we really want to get complicated with these applications, we can start using specific individualized invitations by email. We do this on our go-to platform all the time, which is then not shareable, so that you must register by your email address, and when you come in, that email address ties you to the registration. Nobody else can register. Nobody else can come in. We can allow other viewers, but you're going to be the only official person that is recognized in the application as our authorized owner. So there's a lot you can accomplish with these things, but you can also keep it really simple. Just know you have to have time and people, and say, use your name and address, and then somebody, you have to have manpower in this, person power. Somebody has to manage the confirmation of who's in against our membership list. And that can't be me while I am your president presenting, or manager or treasurer presenting the budget. And it can't be Kathryn while she's managing any slides you want to put up. So this is really at least a two-person behind-the-scene job. Now, one may be one of our directors who doesn't have a role speaking. Maybe they manage the slides, but you have to put manpower, person power on administering this platform. Then it's fairly easy once you start doing it. Okay, any other questions? We'd love to hear.
On the screen, you're seeing our contact information. So if you have additional questions after we're done tonight, you are welcome to contact us. Whether you are our client or not, we're happy to help you and happy to answer your questions.
And visit our resources. Visit our website, ljlaw.com, but under resources, we've got a lot of great stuff for you. We're not getting questions. Thank you for all the comments that we were awesome. Jamie and Kathryn in particular. Thank you for all the support you've given the board.
It was great having you tonight,
Yes.
and I hope you learned
Thank you for
something
letting
that's
us do
usable.
this.
Thank you, guys.
And get it.
Heritage team, thank you so much for letting us do this.
Agreed.
We hope everyone stays safe and healthy.
Have a good night.
Have a good night, guys.
Good night, guys.